The biggest murder mystery in the world? Have you ever read a mind-bending murder mystery fiction novel where there are as many as 20 suspects and the investigator has to determine which one committed the crime? Well, that's nothing compared to this real-life murder. The murder weapon? A revolver. Shooting distance? Less than 1 meter. The bullet? Instantaneously fatal. Witnesses? Several. Murderer? Unknown. Suspects? More than 100. Victim? Imagine it's the year 1986. Someone walks up to a man on a street in the capital and shoots him in the back. Similar incidents occur in most countries, in most capitals, and it is not uncommon for the murderer to escape justice. Something tragic, but so far, nothing extraordinary. But then, imagine if someone confesses to the crime and is not prosecuted. Then another person confesses, also without prosecution. A third, a fourth, and eventually a fifth person confess, still without prosecution. Eventually, more than 130 people will claim they held the revolver and pulled the trigger that fired the shot that started what the police call the biggest murder investigation of all time. The shot that killed the Prime Minister of Sweden. How can someone shoot the Prime Minister from less than a meter's distance without being seized by bodyguards? How has the murderer managed to elude the police to this very day? Why did someone want to kill him in the first place? And why did so many people doubt the Prime Minister's wife when she said she knew who murdered her husband? Some people would say the mystery has actually been solved, but more about that later. This is the story of the murder of Olof Palme and the immense and unsuccessful police investigation that followed, the bizarre events that surrounded the murder, and the many theories about what really happened. They say that Sweden changed forever that night. Before it, Swedes thought they lived in the safest country in the world, a haven far removed from the evils and machinations of the big bad world. But after this day, it was as if something had been broken. The morning after the murder, people woke up to the horrifying news, and it is often said that that was the day Sweden lost its innocence. A late-night visit to the cinema, Mozart, South Africa, the funniest man in Sweden, mysterious men with walkie-talkies in the streets, the CIA, a Kurdish wedding, the suspicious behavior of the police, the drug abuser who became a household name and even got an alcoholic drink named after him. How do all these elements come together? We will explore all this and more in this video. But before we proceed, let's look at the man himself, Olof Palme. As so often happens with unsolved murders, the mystery becomes more talked about than the victim. There is an allure to the mystique surrounding something unsolved, but we shouldn't forget the individuals who once lived and walked among us. We shouldn't reduce them to mere victims, saints, or mysteries, but also remember them as people. Olof Palme was a charismatic leader, perhaps more loved than any politician in Sweden before or after him, and more hated. But whether one liked him or not, there was no denying he was a witty and gifted speaker. Some claim too gifted. Allegedly, he was so rhetorically superior to his opponents in debates that some people wouldn't vote for him just because they felt sorry for the other guy. Born into an upper-class family, he was later in life called a class traitor for joining the Social Democrats Party. He was an outspoken person who publicly decried the Vietnam War and opposed the apartheid regime in South Africa. According to himself, he became a social democrat partly because of the injustices he witnessed in the world during his travels in the USA and Asia. We strongly recommend you read more about Olof Palme, but for now we will return to the murder, which has since become a significant part of Swedish culture and folklore. Where and when did it happen? The murder occurred on the 28th of February 1986 at 23:21 p.m. while the Prime Minister was walking home from the cinema with his wife Lisbeth Palme on the central Stockholm street Sveavägen. The Prime Minister had watched the Swedish movie Bröderna och Morsat. The murderer swiftly ran away from the scene. Why was the murderer not seized by bodyguards? The answer is simple. The Prime Minister didn't have any bodyguards with him. He had called the police earlier in the day and said he didn't need them that night. This was a much more innocent time in Sweden, and even though there were many people who hated Palme and wanted to see him dead, he probably thought it ridiculously unlikely that something like this would happen. However, some conspiracy theories suggest there were more sinister reasons why he dismissed them. As you shall see, conspiracy theories abound when it comes to this case. About 2.5 minutes after the murder, the first police car arrived, and thus began what would become perhaps the biggest, and according to some, the most mismanaged murder investigation of all time. A man named Hans Holmér took charge of the investigation, which proved to be a significant mistake, as he had no qualifications for it. He ignored most of the tips the police received and chose to focus almost solely on his own favorite theory, that the PKK, a Kurdish guerrilla organization, was responsible. Among the things that made Holmér suspicious of the PKK was a telephone call the police had bugged where PKK members spoke about a wedding which the police thought was code for murdering Olof Palme. Later, this theory was dropped, even though Hans Holmér had said he was 95% sure that it was the Kurds. He had to leave the investigation, but later wrote a book where he still suggested the Kurds might be guilty. The next major suspect was a man referred to in the media as the 33-year-old. No strong evidence could be found, so this lead was also dropped. This ex-suspect moved to the USA, where he was later murdered by an ex-cop. Then, in 1988, a new man was prosecuted by the police. His name was Christer Pettersson, a ruffian previously convicted of manslaughter. He was well known in the underworld, and the police received a tip that he had been in the vicinity of Olof Palme on the night of the murder. The next year, 1989, he was found guilty of the Prime Minister's murder and imprisoned. So at last, the murder was solved? No, of course not. It wasn't that easy. Christer Pettersson was found guilty primarily because Olof Palme's wife, who had survived the shooting, identified him in a witness confrontation. When Pettersson appealed to a higher court, he was found not guilty and was released. The main reason was that the witness confrontation had been mismanaged. The police had made an unforgivable blunder by telling Lisbeth Palme before the confrontation that the man they suspected was an alcoholic. Lisbeth Palme had experience working with alcoholics, and when she watched the witness confrontation tape, she quickly said, "There, it is him. I can see who is an abuser." Because of this comment and the information the police had provided her beforehand, she was deemed an unreliable witness, and Christer Pettersson was released. But was he innocent? The question divided the country. Some claimed, and still claim to this day, that Pettersson was obviously the one who did it. The Prime Minister's wife had seen him. She would know. She never changed her mind. Then there were those who thought it ridiculous that such an amateurish ruffian could perform this kind of murder. And where was the motive? Guilty or not, Christer Pettersson's fate was now forever tied to Olof Palme's murder. No one could see him without wondering if he had done it. He was an intelligent man, well-spoken, but worn by a tough life. Some found him charming in his own way, though others were terrified of his wild eyes and unpredictable manner. When Christer Pettersson was found not guilty of the murder, he went to his neighbor to celebrate and was seen carrying Bailey's and Explorer vodka. This combination then became a famous or infamous drink you could order at nightclubs. They called it the Killer. And some years ago, when Sweden was getting new banknotes, there were those who jokingly suggested Christer Pettersson should be on them. Later on, Christer Pettersson more or less confessed to the newspapers that he had murdered Olof Palme, but he always ended up retracting his statements. One time he admitted that he could have been the murderer, but claimed that he couldn't actually remember. There are some who take his confessions as proof of his guilt, and others who are convinced that his confessions were just a way for him to make money from the newspapers. He spent his life going in and out of prison and finally died in 2004. The then Prime Minister of Sweden, Olof Palme, commented, "It is a tragic life that has now come to an end." But was there a different narrative happening behind the scenes? There is also a theory that leads right into the police force. Were police officers the ones behind the murder? It is well known that several policemen did not think highly of Olof Palme and even wanted to see him dead. Many police officers at the time weren't shy about being right-wing extremists, even greeting each other with the Nazi salute. This went against everything Olof Palme stood for politically and morally, creating conflict between the Prime Minister and the police. This, combined with the train wreck of an investigation that followed the murder, makes this theory one of the more popular ones. Did the police botch the investigation intentionally as a cover-up? Nothing has been proven, but the police investigation has not only been called the biggest in history, but also the most mishandled. South Africa, the CIA, or the KGB? Other theories claim that the South African Secret Service, the CIA, or the KGB were behind the murder. The reasons? Olof Palme was critical of the apartheid regime that ruled South Africa at that time. He pursued political policies that did not suit the USA and was perceived as flirting too much with the Soviet Union. Ironically, those behind the KGB theory think he was murdered for being too friendly with NATO, the US and European alliance against the Soviets. The Skandia Man. In 2020, 34 years after the murder, the police said at a press conference that they had found the murderer, but that he couldn't be arrested because he was dead. His name was Stig Engström, aka the Skandia Man. The police then presented the evidence supporting their theory. To many people's disappointment, the evidence was weak, and had the suspect been alive, it probably would not have been enough to even take him to court. The suspect had long been known by the police as one of the witnesses to the murder, but he had never been seriously considered as a main suspect before. A newspaper ran a story about him some years before the press conference, presenting more or less the same evidence that the police later put forward. The police had hoped to find conclusive evidence before going public with their suspicions, but they found nothing new. There is a series on Netflix called The Unlikely Murderer, which tells the story of Skandia Man and the murder of Olof Palme. In the series, the suspect is portrayed by Swedish actor Robert Gustafsson, who is mostly known for his comedic performances and is often referred to as the funniest man in Sweden. Interestingly enough, Gustafsson actually saw Olof Palme shortly before his murder, as they both watched the same viewing of Bröderna Morsat at the same cinema that fateful night. Gustafsson has said that he is not convinced that the man he portrays in the series is the actual killer. The murder continues to puzzle people around the world. Who were the mysterious men with walkie-talkies that many witnesses reported seeing that evening? Why was Palme attacked on the very night he dismissed his bodyguards? And why were the police so eager to claim Scandiaman as the perpetrator when the evidence was so lacking? There are hundreds of books about the case and an infinite number of theories and suspects. We will probably never know for sure who did it. If you're intrigued enough to read through the entire case, you can actually request a copy of the official documents from the police. Since the investigation has been closed, they are now available to the public like most other police documents. Generally speaking, you have to pay a small price for this service, usually less than $1 per document. However, due to the extensive length of Olof Palme's murder investigation, you would have to pay approximately $100,000, and it would take you about a decade to read through it all. Is this the biggest murder mystery in the world? There are, of course, other cases that could give it a good match, but considering the high status of the victim, the size of the investigation, and the number of theories and suspects, this is certainly one of the strongest contenders.